up your place, so we'll have arm wrestling or something, and whoever goes against Mike will lose. Okay, so I suppose there's a certain amount of congratulations in order. You finally made it to the New Testament. So, all of that hard work that we've been doing here through for the last couple of years, it's a good thing, again, to just sort of hold up the book and do the experiment where you look at this thing and really realize, like, wow, that New Testament's really skinny compared to the Old Testament. The Old Testament's really fat. It's a really big book, or several big books. And so, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about this a little bit when we were doing the prophets, that there's this aspect of intensification as you go through the Old Testament, that the greater the time span, the less amount of text you have. Okay? And so as you go on, the text gets bigger and bigger, and the time span that it's covering actually gets smaller. So there's kind of more attention given to the events and people that are being presented. There's more attention given to them as time goes on, until we reach here in the New Testament the fullness of time. So, well, I know it's been a long summer also, but maybe just by way of getting our machinery working again here, who would like to recap where we've been? So, the message of the Old Testament. What have we been through up to this point? And you've only got, a couple of sentences to say this in, so don't go off on a big thing. But who would like to recap what the Old Testament's about? What was that all about that we just finished over the last couple of years? And then maybe the Old Testament in general, but then I also want to ask the question of the prophets in particular, because that's what we just did last semester. So, first, the Old Testament. What's it about? What was all of that about? We just made it through we slogged through how many ever, 1,000 pages or so of text. And so what's it about? Before we move on, go ahead, Marty.
Just that Adam broke God's original covenant with man, and God has been seeking to reestablish his covenant, but it's all been building up to just how he's going to do it.
Okay.
To bring all people into his covenant.
Okay. Good. So, okay, that's good. Focus on these ideas, this notion of the covenant, this intrinsic special relationship with God that only certain people have. And we saw that first. Remember the first time that distinction was made between blessing and covenant, back in the story of Isaac and Ishmael. Yeah. God says to Abraham, I'll bless Ishmael. He'll be a king and have lots of kids and rich and whatever else. I'll bless him. Fine. But my covenant is going to be with Isaac. So there's this distinction between blessing and covenant. What is the nature of the covenant? What does that mean? What does it mean that God's going to bring people into his covenant, if it doesn't mean blessing? Because God himself makes a distinction between blessing and covenant when he's talking to Isaac, or rather talking to Abraham about Isaac and Ishmael. So what's a covenant? That's kind of important for the Old Testament. I mean, for the New one too, actually. That's what the word testament, means actually. It's a covenant. So what's it mean? Or what is a covenant? Yeah.
It's a contract, as an agreement, a promise.
Okay. That's right. So it has that aspect to it, a contract, an agreement, promises. If you do X, I'll do Y. On its most basic, natural level, they actually still use that term sometimes in legal documents even today, covenants. But there's an added notion to it in the biblical revelation that we have. And what is that added bit? Aside from just being a sort of an agreement, like you do X, I'll do Y, what does it have to it? Yeah. Go ahead.
It's got, if you break it, there's death.
Okay, but okay, so that's the negative side of it. Maybe you're referring to that thing Jeremiah talks about with the covenant of the pieces, right? You divide the animal in half, and this means if I break my end of the covenant, I'm going to be like these tortured, screwed up, cut in half animals. Yeah. So, but that's the negative side of it. If I break it, what's the positive side?
Is it sonship or something like that?
Yeah, or at least, at the very least, a kind of a new life. In other words, the covenant establishes a new kind of life. That there's the breaking of it incurs death, but the flip side of that is the keeping of it makes for this new kind of life, what we would call in the New Testament here grace, sonship with God, God's sons. So, in a certain respect, this notion of the covenant throughout the Old Testament has always been kind of at each step of the way. Adam is imaged as a son of God, which we'll see Luke actually call him that explicitly. The people of Israel are called God's firstborn son. And then as we go on through the prophets, we come to realize that Israel itself is just a sort of a type or a historical participation, a historical sign of this universal call to sonship for all people. And that's what we see really where it's brought to this fruition in the prophets. That what is the case on a historical particularity kind of level with Israel is now going to be something that's given to every nation on earth. But even that, all peoples. But even that idea that God wants to extend this offer of coming into his family, if you want to put it that way, to everybody. That's even been there from the beginning. You even see that in the beginning in the command, for example, to the man and the woman to be fertile and multiply. You're going to welcome others into this communion with God that you already have, in some sense. Or you see it in the promise God made to Abraham. I'm going to make you a blessing to all the nations. So I'm going to increase you and make you great. All the nations of the earth are going to bless themselves by you, are going to be blessed in you. So this is part of God's big plan from the beginning of creation, and then sort of following through the fall, as Marty put it, that God is always trying to bring about the same thing, namely communion between himself and humanity. I want to put it that way, that the prophets begin to see very clearly, though, that this isn't just something intended for Israel, but it has this sort of universal scope. And it's going to be brought about by a redeemer, an individual of some sort. And we saw a lot of that in the prophets, particularly Isaiah and the suffering servants, and how it's going to bring about. It's a bit of a mystery, but we kind of know something, especially from Isaiah. Let me ask this now: what is the final books of our Old Testament, anyway? If you happen to be Catholic, slightly different if you're Jewish or Protestant, but our last books are the books of Maccabees. The last books of the Old Testament. What do they add to the picture that we get? So there's all this preparation for this great universal call to covenant, the new covenant, as Jeremiah the prophet calls it, not like the old covenant. Fine. And then we get to the book of Maccabees. What does that add to the picture? Yeah.
You see your first martyrs, and that you have to be willing to die for.
Good. So that's good. So we saw little aspects of that maybe in some of the other prophets, like Daniel suffers for proclaiming the word of God among the pagans. Jeremiah suffers for proclaiming it among his own people. And there's the 3 children in the furnace and all of that. But here we see kind of at least a representative portion of the Jewish people ready to die, and actually dying, rather than transgressing even the slightest aspect of the law, rather than giving up their relationship with God. They'd rather give up their life, and they're ready to do that precisely because of their faith in the resurrection. You see that in the Maccabees too, the mother speaking to her children about, I don't know how you came to be. I mean, I I was there, obviously, but it's a mystery. And God who gave you life can give it back to you. So that this universal restoration that God is promising is going to be brought about by a resurrection. So we've seen this pattern throughout the Old Testament of kind of God establishes his people, Adam or David or whoever. His people, they fall, they break the covenant, they mess up, and there's a kind of a decline, and it usually ends as it did with Adam, as it did with the people as a whole, in exile. They get kicked out, they're thrown out of his presence. They're physically kicked out of the land or the place, the garden, the place of familiarity and intimacy with God. So they're thrown out of that. And that physical kicking out, that physical exile is the sort of the correlative. It's the thing that reveals what's going on interiorly, the spiritual exile from God that mankind in sin experiences. So the prophets have prophesied all over the place this restoration that's going to be universal and going to come about through a resurrection, and it's also going to come about through this figure of the suffering servant who somehow or other is going to take upon himself all of the punishment, the curses of that exile. He's going to take it all upon himself. So if that's our that's the other thing, I guess. The other anything else about Maccabees, what it adds to our picture of the Old Testament and how it's looking forward to the New. Go ahead.
There's an expectation of hopefully eventually a prophet showing up at the time and kind of fix things.
Yeah, like there's that kind of happens at key points throughout the books. You're like, well, we really don't know what to do. We're kind of waiting for a prophet to come and show us what's up. There's this period of the silence of the Word of God that Amos, the first prophet, prophesied would happen. And they're in that period, and there's this expectation that's waiting for the prophet to come. There's also this, and it's a more negative way of looking at it, but it's still very important. And it's to say that whatever the restoration is going to be, however this reinstatement of the covenant or the renewal of the covenant or the universalization of the covenant is going to happen, it's not going to be, Mel Gibson Braveheart way of doing it. It isn't going to be that. That's what we saw with the Maccabees. They had this great historical moment where there was a Mel Gibson Braveheart, taking back of the temple and the land and the tossing out of the bad guys. But we see clearly, like within their lifetime, it's already on this steady decline, as mankind always has been. So it's a very partial, very imperfect, and fundamentally kind of flawed restoration. So whatever this restoration that the prophets told us about is going to be, it's not going to be that. It's not going to be this sort of military victory in the normal way of thinking about that. So, all right. So all of that is background. Let's see. Do you remember the basic 4-part structure of the Old Testament? We've talked about a number of times, like how you divide up into 4 parts. There's the Pentateuch, and it's sort of like the foundational realities, and then the historical development, and the wisdom literature is the sort of contemplative or contemplating of that history. Finally, with prophecy, then a sort of look to the future. And we talked also, I think, about how this is paralleled in our New Testament canon. The way that our New Testament canon is set up is fundamentally the same. I mean, it's the same sort of setup. So just as we have in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, the presentation or the revelation of the fundamental realities about God, creation, the fall, the promise of a Redeemer. So in the New Testament, the first part, the Gospels, also present us with the foundational realities of that Redeemer who begins a new creation. So it's a creation and new creation. So there's kind of a beginning again. So we'll be doing the Synoptic Gospels as they are called, and we'll talk about a little bit about why they're called that in this class, and also doing Acts of the Apostles. When we get to Luke and to Acts of the Apostles, we'll be discussing in more detail why we study Luke and Acts together, even though they're not right together in the canon. I mean, one reason's obvious, is because Luke wrote both of them, right? But there's more to it than just that. So for now, just take it on faith that it makes a lot of theological and narrative sense to sort of study those two books side by side, or one after the other, and to be constantly flipping back between one and the other while you're doing it. In the rest of today's class, for which we have 35 minutes left, I see, or something like that, we want to talk a little bit about the question of the Gospels themselves, and sort of leave Acts of the Apostles out of the equation here for a minute, because it's sort of a different thing that's going on there. I don't know if I've told you this story or not, maybe I have, but just to review it, if I have told it to you. I had a good buddy in graduate school who now teaches at Wyoming Catholic College. His name's Jeremy Holmes. He's actually one of the big contributors and translators of the biblical commentaries of St. Thomas Aquinas that are now, I think they're in your bookstore now. Anyway, he and I were good buddies during graduate school. Our family sort of grew up together there. It was kind of fun because I was an Old Testament major and he was a New Testament major. And I used to chide him on the fact that he didn't have very much to major on because he has this skinny little book thing and I had this big fat thing. But anyway, he was a great friend and a good sort of companion through graduate school. Many times his enthusiasm for what we were doing kept me going. Graduate school was hard. You get out in the middle, it's kind of like swimming the English Channel, and you're like, well, should I just keep going or go back? And you're like, well, I'm in the middle now, I guess I should just keep going. Anyway, so it's as easy as going back. But anyway, he had this teacher, a lady by the name of Carol Stockhausen, who was a Pauline scholar. She was into Paul. Anyway, and they were just chatting in the break room one day, and she was just saying hi, and who are you? And I think he was relatively new there at the time. And she asked him, so what do you specialize in, while you're here? Because that's what graduate school is all about. It's all about hyper-specialization. So he said, well, I want to specialize or study especially the Gospels. That's what I want to focus on. And without blinking an eye, she said, oh, you're Catholic, are you? Aren't you? Are you Catholic? And he's like, yes, I am, actually. Well, how did you know? How do you jump from, I want to study the Gospels, to I'm Catholic? And she said, oh, it's just a kind of a universal thing I've noticed in my years here. Because in the graduate program, it was at Marquette in Milwaukee. It's a Catholic school, but, about half of the people were not Catholic in the graduate program. A lot of Protestants, ministers and stuff. Anyhow, she just said, well, I've just experienced it over the year. Catholics always want to study the Gospels, and Protestants always want to study Paul. And so he was like, well, that's interesting. What is it that makes us want to do this? Or why do Catholics want to study the Gospels? Well, I guess in a certain respect, you can sort of see this even in the liturgy, I guess. The reason we want to study the Gospels is kind of the same reason that the liturgy is sort of structured the way it is, all around Christ, the person of Christ, and the reality of his presence in the world, and this sort of stuff. So just as the Eucharist and the Gospel and the Eucharist are sort of the two foci around which everything in the liturgy rotates, if you want to put it that way. It's the same thing, that the Catholic instinct sort of gravitates towards the Gospels because Christ is there. Jesus is there. Have you seen him whom my heart loves? The way that the Psalms puts it. So, who knows what the word gospel means? What's the word gospel mean? We got to start with basics here. Gospel. Where do we get that word in English? Yeah. It does mean good news. Why does it mean that, though? Can you tell that from the word itself, or? Because there is a way to tell it. I want to make sure we know. It's good to know these things. My next PhD will be in etymology. If you guys don't know, I'm crazy about this stuff. So.
It's Germanic root from God, for God, and it's spelled, which
That's right. That's kind of the idea. That's right. So this comes from this part of it comes originally from God, right? So this is basically the word God, and this is spell. So not the was it like the 1970s musical Godspell? Like right up there with Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. But Godspell. So spell. We still have this use of the word in English. When we say, well, he didn't know the way to use the printer, that would be me. So I had to spell it out for him, So to spell something means to tell it out part by part. Okay. So the Godspell, but actually here, make sure we know this too. God is actually short for good. It comes from the word good. So it's good spell, which somebody already said it means good news or good message. A good message or a good telling out of the thing. And this just goes back to the Greek. So if you look in your Greek, you'll have EU at the beginning of your title. And over here you'll have angelos or angelion, something like that. Seth, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't that the idea? Is it angelion? Euangelion, which just so the EU prefix in Greek words just means good. So that's where we get like euphony means good sound, or a eulogy is a good word. Actually, even euthanasia means good death. You see, that's a clever euphemism there. But anyway, and you see here in Evangelion, you see the word angel here, right there, and that's messenger. So the angels are messengers, but this is just message. So a good message, and or good news, good new thing. So that's the basic word. The other question I want to make sure we cover in today's class is, well, there's two. Why are there four? And how come those four are divided into two groups, 3 and 1? Why do we do that? We study them that way, but there's a long tradition stretching back at least as far as St. Augustine, really a good deal further. No, it goes back to Irenaeus. I take it back. It goes at least as far back as Irenaeus, so it's way back. You treat them in two groups, and there's 3 in one group, and there's 1 in another group. So first of all, why are there 4? Why are there 4 Gospels? It's an interesting question to ask because there was actually a guy in the early church by the name of Tatian who wrote what was called the Diatessaron. Maybe you've heard of it. And Diatessaron just means a harmony of 4. And so where he took the 4 Gospels and sort of put them, one on top of the other, or sort of rearranged the parts so that they read as one continuous narrative from beginning to end. Okay, so you'd start with like the prologue of John. Then you'd go to like Luke's infancy narrative. Then you go to Matthew's infancy narrative. Then you do something from Mark, so on. So that he kind of cut and pasted so that he had one continuous, humongous super gospel, from 4. The interesting thing about that is I guess there is some weird, that's the wrong word, sorry. There is some either sect or rite, maybe even, I don't think it's a rite of the church. There's some Christian sect or other that still uses the Diatessaron in their liturgy. They'll read from the Diatessaron. But at least as far as the church, for the most part, East and West, rejected that tendency, the tendency to sort of just conflate the 4 Gospels into one, at least in the liturgy. The Diatessaron was fine to read for devotional purposes, but in the liturgy, no, you keep them separate. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how come? So the church rejected this notion that there's, one big super gospel, that you can just conflate it into one. So it wants to pay attention to the differences, the distinction between the 4. The other side of the coin, so the person is like, why is there not just one gospel? Well, I don't know why exactly, but At the very least, you can see that the church rejected that tendency to sort of conflate them into one. But what on the flip side of it, if you look at actually this is kind of interesting. We've talked about this before maybe, but look at the last verse of John's gospel, because he leads you to believe that there ought to be even more gospels than there are. He says, last verse of John. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. Do you have it there, Mike? Read it.
But there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written for everyone, the world itself, I think, would not be able to contain the books that should be written.
Yeah. So Jesus did and said a whole bunch of other things. And remember that word for world there? What's the Greek word for world? We talked about this before. What is it? It's cosmos. He doesn't mean planet Earth. He means the whole universe isn't big enough. Wouldn't be big enough to fit all the Gospels that could be written about what Jesus did and said. Whoa. So, John seems, the last verse of the last Gospel seems to claim there could be 1,000,000,000, billion, trillion Gospels. So why aren't there? Why are we stuck with 4? The church's instinct is like, well, there shouldn't be 1, and there shouldn't be 1,000,000, billion, even though there could be. There's got to be 4. Why does there have to be 4? It's interesting. I'm going to read you a little blurb here from Saint Irenaeus. So he's like, when is Saint Irenaeus? He's like 90-ish AD. So this is pretty early. He seems to just be repeating a tradition already. So he learned from Polycarp, who learned from Saint John. So it's not. This is very early tradition. He says this. Just listen. It is not possible that the Gospels be either more or fewer in number than they are. They can't be 3. There can't be 5. There has to be 4. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side and vivifying men afresh. Pause for a minute. Notice he's not quoting exactly, but he's paraphrasing words from what book when he talks about the 4 vivifying mankind and going out and the spirit of life. What's that come from? What's his language being borrowed from there? Yeah.
Did you refer to apocalypse there, or are you talking about would be in the major prophets in Ezekiel?
Ezekiel shows the water going out of the temple and vivifying the world, but it doesn't specifically mention 4. Remember?
Genesis.
Exactly. Genesis 2, remember the rivers that went out of Eden go out and they water the whole earth. So there were 4 of them, and it specifically mentions there were 4. It gives you their names, it tells you where they went, and all that kind of stuff. So he's recalling. I mean, really, it's a very ancient tradition here that he's saying this is how you interpret those 4 streams of Genesis. Those are a type or some sort of typology of the 4 Gospels, and he bases it in a kind of. It's interesting. It's like both numerological but also kind of geographical. But just in the sense of our spatial existence, our bodily existence is the reason there had to be 4. Because there's 4 directions, and it sort of means universal. So this biblical symbolism isn't just random. It's actually founded in our nature in some way. That's the way he sees it. It's fascinating. So he goes on. Let's see here. From which fact, it is evident that the Word, capital W, the artificer of all, he that sitteth upon the cherubim, and remember there were 4 cherubim, and contains all things, he who was manifested to men, has given us the gospel under 4 aspects. Very interesting. So there's one gospel in his mind, in Irenaeus' mind. Yeah, there is one gospel. There's one good news. There's one message, one word. But it's under 4 aspects. Okay? And that's what we want to try to tease out here the rest of this semester, like, what is the aspect of Matthew? What is the aspect of Luke or of Mark? And eventually John. Thanks. Okay, let me finish reading this before we run out of time. Wait, don't we go till? When do we go till? 10:25. Okay. Okay, good. I was looking at the wrong one. Let me finish reading this. Where was it? As also David says when entreating his manifestation, "Thou that sittest between the cherubim, shine forth. For the cherubim too were four-faced, and their faces were images of the dispensation of the Son of God. For as the Scripture says, the first living creature was like a lion, symbolizing his effectual working, his leadership, his royal power. The second living creature was like a calf, signifying his sacrificial and sacerdotal order. But the third had, as it were, the face of a man, an evident description of his advent as a human being. The fourth was like a flying eagle, pointing out the gift of the Spirit hovering with his wings over the church. And therefore the Gospels are in accord with these things, among which Christ is seated." So this long-standing tradition, you still see it in iconography, it's on your baldacchino in the church and everywhere else. There's these four living creatures that are seen, or the four-faced creatures that are seen in the vision of Ezekiel and elsewhere, correspond to the four Gospels. And the Gospels correspond to these four aspects. And we'll have to sort of try and dig out what exactly that means. What is the aspect of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John? So the Gospels have to be four. It makes all kinds of sense that there be four, not more, not less. So the next question we want to answer before we run away here is, how come we're studying only three? If there's four, why are we just taking this semester to just study three of them? Well, there's a long-standing tradition also that these three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, belong together. Let me read you a little quote here from St. Augustine on this. "But again, those three living creatures, the lion, the man, and the calf, have their course upon this earth. And in like manner, those three evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, occupy themselves chiefly with the things which Christ did in the flesh, and with the precepts which he delivered to men, who also bear the burden of the flesh, for their instruction in the rightful exercise of this mortal life." So those three creatures indicate something about the aspect of those three Gospels. Whereas John, on the other hand, this is still Augustine, soars like an eagle above the clouds of human infirmity, and gazes upon the light of the unchangeable truth with those keenest and steadiest eyes of the heart. So, at least as far back as Irenaeus, and Augustine's just sort of reappropriating the tradition, it's been seen also that there has to be four, and the four makes sense. It makes a great deal of sense, and part of God's plan to study them in 3 and 1, two groups, one group of 3, one group of 1, and if you can call one a group, but anyway. So it's interesting if you go through the fathers. They differently appropriate which creature belongs to which gospel. Not everybody agrees on, so does the lion mean Mark, or does it mean Matthew, or whatever. So there's different interpretations about that. But it is interesting that almost universally, I think there's one exception, everybody says the eagle is John. Everybody says that. The other three, well, it's up for grabs maybe a little bit. There's even kind of a consensus among those. But anyway, so it makes sense that there's this 3 and 1 division between the Gospels, the first 3 Gospels and the last Gospel. The last thing then is just to note that this notion that the 3 should belong together, it's based really upon, not just upon their aspect, but even their very wording. There's a lot of word for word similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is why they're called synoptic, which means they can be seen together. Synoptic, so to see together. You can kind of look at them together because their wording is so similar. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. So I guess we're out of time here. Yeah. So let's stop. And tomorrow, you can read the first chapter of Matthew. We'll see if we get to it tomorrow. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sit